I'm speaking to you this week from a hotel in Sydney, where I'm getting ready to join other representatives from around Australia for the Standing Committee of the General Synod. Meets twice a year face to face and conducts the business of the General Synod when the Synod isn't in session. So it's a robust group of about 35 people, and you can imagine they're all opinionated and all speak usually pretty eloquently. So it's a fairly robust meeting. Anyway, I want to just focus for you on today's gospel reading this week, and also talk a bit about the idea of bearing witness. This is from St. Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, beginning at the 36th verse. While the disciples were talking about all these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead, and on the third day the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." Most of us find the word witness slightly uncomfortable. We associate it perhaps with Silent Witness, that marvellous TV program where forensic pathologists open up bodies and try and find clues to how the murder happened. Some of you might associate the word witness with Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are earnest and well-meaning folk who tramp around our homes and try and bring us the good news according to Jehovah. Some of you might associate the word witnessing with street preachers or Salvation Army timbrel bands, depending on how old you are. But for the most part, good old Anglicans are not very comfortable with the word witness. And yet, for those of us who try to be Easter people, bearing witness to the resurrection is one of the most important things we do. In fact, in the ordinal, when people are made bishops, the first thing that's in the exhortation is the bishop is to maintain the church's witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So witness happens at various levels: personal, organisational, perhaps even global, if we like to think of the global mission of the church. Today's gospel gives us a bit of an insight into what it means to bear witness. The word itself comes from a Greek word that we recognise and use in English, that is martyr. And the martyrs were thought to be people who particularly bore witness to their faith, because not only did they preach the gospel, but they put their lives on the line for the gospel's sake. So here in Ballarat, we have a special affection for the martyrs of Papua New Guinea, those men and women who just a generation before our own lives put their lives on the line to serve the people God had sent them too as missionaries and as witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. In today's gospel reading, the first half is really Jesus bearing witness to the disciples that he has been raised from the dead. When he appears to the disciples, as usual, he says those comforting words, "Peace be with you," but we hear that they were still terrified and full of doubts because they thought they were seeing a ghost. So Jesus, as he does with Thomas and the other disciples in the upper room, shows them his hands and his feet and says, "These bear witness to what has happened to me. You know the story. You know that I died on the cross. See the wounds. They are testimony in themselves. They bear witness to who I am." And then he showed them his hands and his feet. And then the gospel writer gives us a wonderful insight. While in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. So they're holding in tension disbelief, wonder, and uncertainty, but also extreme joy. They have this clash of hearts and minds is going on in the disciples. They're delighted to see Jesus again, but they're wondering, how could this be? They don't know quite what to believe. They're caught up in this mysterious event. And so then Jesus talks to them some more. So Jesus is speaking to them, telling them that he's been raised from the dead. He then shows them his wounds, and they are filled with joy and disbelief simultaneously. Isn't that good news for us? And then he does something quite extraordinary. He says, "Have you got anything to eat?" And so they give him some fish, and he eats it in their presence as a sign that he is a real body who can eat and drink. This is not a ghost. He's bearing witness to the physical resurrection from the dead by having some food in front of them. It's just extraordinary, isn't it? We so like to sacralise these things, but in fact the disciples are just like we would be, happy as anything that Jesus seems to be alive, but wondering, how could this possibly be? And even where Jesus bears witness by showing us his wounds, we're still not sure. And so he does the most practical human thing. He has some food, so has a bit of a snack, and says to the disciples, "See, I'm not a ghost. I'm a real human being." So that first half of today's gospel is extraordinary, really, because it's Jesus has to bear witness to himself, because nobody really believes that he's risen from the dead. And it's only when he doesn't just talk to them, but it's only when he actually lives out the life of a normal human being, and they touch him and they feed him, that they come to believe. And yet they are still filled with both joy and disbelief simultaneously. The second half of the gospel, Jesus goes on to explain the scriptures to the disciples and says, "Remember, I talked about this before, how on the third day I would be raised again, and the Son of Man would be raised again." And you can imagine the disciples nodding their heads in agreement, but in their hearts thinking, "Oh no, what's this going to mean?" And so Jesus just says, "This is what the scriptures say. The scriptures bear witness to me as well, that this business about dying and being raised is something that we have heard about for generations in the Jewish faith. It's now been fulfilled in Jesus himself." Then Jesus does the most astoundingly outrageous thing. At the end of his little sermonette, it's only about 3 verses, he says, "You are witnesses to these things." There's no way out for the disciples. They want to be on the edge looking in. But in fact, Jesus has drawn them so close and so entwined his life with theirs that there's only one thing they can do, and that is to bear witness to what they have seen and heard and have come to believe. It would be tempting, wouldn't it, to think that that's the end of the matter and they all just dispersed and went off to be fantastic missionaries. But we know that the lives of the disciples, even after the resurrection, were a jumble of belief, joy, and disbelief. And so we can take some comfort when we struggle with the idea of the physical resurrection of Jesus, that it's never been easy for his disciples. And yet, they have always been called, as we are called, to bear witness, to give testimony to the fact that we believe that in Jesus, God was doing something altogether new. The most interesting thing about being a witness is that it's not just about what's in your head, it's about what's in your heart as well. And so the most eloquent preachers can have little effect if there's not an authenticity and a coherence between what they say and the way they live their lives. And that's very true for us. If we are to be effective witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we not only have to talk about that in as natural way as we can, but we have to live our lives under the knowledge and the certainty that God can always bring new life from death, that God can always bring hope from what looks like despair, that God can always bring new life from what looks like a dead seed. Sadly, my friends, we are all called to be witnesses. We're not all called to be preachers. We're not all called to knock on doors. We're not all called to be forensic pathologists. But we are all called to speak and live as people who know that Jesus was raised from the dead as the sure sign that death's control over life has been broken forever by the God of love. So welcome to the great company of witnesses. It's our job in our time to speak and live out the truth of the resurrection. The Lord be with you.